to it. So it's much further up in the presentation.
Ordering there is different.
Yeah, right. I'm sorry. You're right. So this is school division CIP projects by total cost.
Yep.
Thank you. So my question is, are those projects that were already underway at the time you asked for the data? Are they in CIPs for some period forward, or how is that? What are the numbers actually include? Everything for a 10-year period, or?
Yeah, they are planned prospective projects, and with most CIP timeframes and in most school divisions, a 5-year planning
Okay.
horizon. Some cases it's 7, 10,
Right.
15, but the typical planning horizon is 5 years. So these are, planned, on the board, desired.
From
Projects for funding.
fiscal 22 forward, or 21?
DJ, do you recall?
And
what
it's a minor thing. I'm just really curious about it.
Yeah, 21 on.
21 forward, okay.
Yes.
Thank you. That was my only question.
Ms. Jackson? Dr. Robinson?
President, I also want to thank Kent and VJ for the presentation. President Gecker and I had the opportunity to hear Dr. Lane make the full presentation at the School Commission Modernization, the School Construction and Modernization Commission meeting. I just want to observe that the comprehensive nature of this presentation is as significant as I've seen in the many years of looking at capital presentations related to a state need. So, very well. Good job. Thank you.
Small army of 8 or 10 who worked on it.
Right.
Just ask one quick question, if that's okay. I noticed that you do have this section on net zero energy standards, and it's recommended, I guess, that people now design to net zero. The way you get to net zero is typically to make the building tighter, less breathable, which, one of the things you're hearing now about sort of the COVID days is maybe the emphasis on the tightness of the building envelope has created a situation where people are getting sicker within buildings that are that tight, and plus you increase the HVAC cost dramatically. I know we were involved, Stuart, actually also with the renovation of Maggie Walker, years ago. And one of the things we finally convinced people to let us do was to leave the windows operable to reduce the HVAC. This is a true thing. There was a lot of push to have the windows not be operable, to tighten the building envelope, to therefore increase the HVAC requirements, but decrease the amount of fresh air going into the building. Are we sure this is where we want to go?
I mean, the net zero is a code requirement that we included in the
Yeah.
guidelines. But I don't mean to debate this, but there are various strategies for building a code zero facility without keeping in mind the health and welfare of the occupants. It doesn't necessarily have to be airtight in the sense that not enough outside air comes in. You use natural light, natural ventilation, less of carbon emission, less of oil and all that.
I've actually built 2 net zero homes. Okay, and there's really, I don't think, clearly you have to do everything you just suggested.
Yeah.
But you also have to make sure the building doesn't breathe that much because the air infiltration impacts the cost of heating and cooling.
Yeah, that's partly true in the sense that you have to have a good insulation system, and the windows and all have to be very airtight so that there is no infiltration.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, even with the net zero requirement, we do have the minimum classroom space sizes and everything.
Yeah, I think what you're going to find over time, honestly, James, is that the professional will move away from quite the tightness of the buildings you're seeing and into more, fresh air exchange than is currently required. But, yes.
Gentlemen, I'd like to say thank you for your presentation, especially from Bristol, Virginia. And there's one thing I would point out is that pre-K programs as well as early childhood facilities moving into the future for or less than 4-year-olds, toddlers.
Yeah. And VJ, can you speak to any new
Yes, we have,
guidelines?
we have,
for the chocolate?
sorry. We have added in our prototypical typical space requirements, spaces for pre-K classrooms. These were not there before. We added that.
They have larger space sizes, and
Yes.
as you would expect, the number of classrooms that a school has is based on the enrollment. So what we set is the space requirements for, a certain student, certain type of student, and then the school divisions through enrollment determine the full square footage of the building.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Dr. Duran.
I appreciate your questions about net zero schools, but I think there's some new innovative ways to do that. We, in Arlington County, we have 3 net zero schools. Just yesterday, the K-12 climate plan that's happening nationally John King and Governor Whitman came to visit the largest net zero school in the country, which is in Arlington. And it was done with open space and a lot of air and a design. You have to be intentional about that, but it is possible. And I think your point is well taken that we have to not just say net zero, but we have to include that with all of the other elements that are necessary for the opportunity to have open air space. For example, there are various balconies, open air areas for students to go out to the library, out of classrooms, to be able to eat right off cafeterias that are very different than normal schools. So just saying net zero is obviously positive, but I agree with Mr. Geckerman. How do we educate about doing that in a way that is going to include more opportunities for that open air space? And it is possible. What I've learned, I didn't know much about net zero schools until recently, and learning the last year about the notion of how it's really about the solar panels and having the right number of roof space for that, and really then enhancing that with the ability to have those open air terraces and balconies or outside spaces. So I think it's a combination of the two, but it can be done, and we have 3 right now that are being very successfully done in ways that have good ventilation and good opportunities for students and staff to have that air.
Great, thank you. Okay, thank you guys very much. I think
Thank you.
we will conclude this meeting with some stuff to do next month, carry it over. We'll move into the standards of accreditation meeting, and then we'll come back to the work session, which will be, as I said, a slightly abbreviated work session from the plan.
Can we have a 5-minute?
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
this point, we're going to convene the special committee to review the standards of accreditation. Typically about this time of day is when my boys are coming home and it's snack time after school, so I encourage the committee members and board to continue to enjoy your snacks. Thank you for joining us today for the meeting of the special committee to review the standards of accreditation. We are delighted to be together in our boardroom, and we welcome those who are watching on YouTube. I'm pleased to report that we are in the home stretch of the important work of this committee, and over the next month, we are wrapping up our work to make recommendations to the full board in October. Since we last met, staff hosted an outreach session with our education stakeholder partners to receive feedback on our proposed revisions. Overall, that stakeholder outreach session went very well. And additionally, staff worked with President Gecker to address some concerns regarding equity plans, comprehensive plans. Before we move into today's presentation from Dr. Sale and committee discussion, have committee members had a chance to review the minutes from the July 21st, 2021 meeting? Can I get a motion to approve or amend the minutes?
Motion to approve the minutes from the July 21st meeting.
May I get a second?
Second.
For the committee members, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, the motion stands. We are pleased to be joined again by Dr. Leslie Sale, VDOE Director of Policy. Today's presentation from Dr. Sale will highlight technical and substantive changes that have been made since the July committee meeting. Our overarching goal for today is to finalize the committee's recommendations. For both board members and the public, you do have a red line document with the specific language changes that accompanies this presentation. So I will turn it over to Dr. Sale to walk us through today's presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Again, I am Dr. Leslie Sale. I am the Director of the Office of Policy with the department. And I am privileged to be again here in front of the board and the SOA Special Committee to help the board and the committee rather close out its work as it relates to the standards of accreditation. And hopefully what we have here today is a package of recommended or suggested amendments, some technical, some substantive, that really speak to the committee's mandate here to address positive, negative, and unintended consequences of the SOA changes that occurred in 2017. As Dr. Anderson noted, I'm going to walk through a few of the edits that have happened since the committee last convened in July. There are only a handful of technical and substantive edits remaining or outstanding that the committee hasn't already reviewed and vetted, but we will walk through these and take a few minutes to reflect on them. And then, of course, as Dr. Anderson mentioned, hopefully the conclusion of the meeting will have us finalizing those recommendations for the committee to bring forward to the full board. I'm going to jump into the technical amendments, but prior to doing that, just as Dr. Anderson noted, the red line document that you have that goes along with and complements this presentation does highlight where the new edits are. So those items are in blue, and you will see that in the index document, which will point you to the page numbers of those particular edits. And then you'll find the edit IDs on those respective pages also are highlighted in blue. So as you're scanning through, hopefully your eye will be drawn towards the items that are new for the group here. So in front of us, I have a list of our amended and added definitions. It looks like a lengthy list, but as we know, we held on providing definition updates until the end of this exercise for us because we knew some of the changes that we were making programmatically or substantively in the remainder of the document would carry over to this portion of the sections of the standards of accreditation. So to that end, we have a handful of definitions that we have amended to do just that. Many reflect the changes that you all have vetted and approved. Some of them are responses to legislative changes, 2017 revisions to make sure we are also in alignment with statutory language. And then a handful are also providing clarification because as you all know, and a goal of this document is to the field as well and to make this something that's accessible and operational as they think about accreditation. Definitions you will see here, there's a pretty common theme is that we have found over the last few years there to be a need to start to create breadcrumbs and connect some of the work that we do in standards of accreditation and related to accreditation indicator with our work through the Office of School Quality and how they support our schools and their continuous improvement efforts. So thinking through that and all of the plans that we discuss and the many different ways that the board engages with schools through accreditation or potentially corrective action plans and memorandums of understanding, we wanted to make sure that there was a clear connection between what those were, the responsibilities of local school divisions, and again, how they interface with accreditation. I won't go through the individual language of each of these. Hopefully you've had a chance to review, but again, we can always go back and take a closer look at the language of any items that are of interest to you. In addition to the definitions, which we did consider to be technical edits, we did make a few organizational changes to the document. So there's probably a few places where you see that there's significant red line or highlighting information. These are actually not significant policy changes or policy changes at all, rather. This is, again, kind of in service of the goal that we talked about of making the SOA an accessible and usable document for our school divisions. So we tried to locate where some certain pieces of information might be intuitively found in the document and relocate those pieces of information there. So you'll see we made some shifts in where you'll find remediation language. So it's no longer in the achievement section, which we often think about in terms of the assessment program, and it's in the instructional program section. We moved and consolidated where we talk about expedited retakes. And probably the most worthy note and organizational change is we moved a section on standard and verified units of credit from after the graduation requirements to between the requirements or achievement expectations and graduation requirements. We felt like intuitively, oftentimes credits follow achievement and finishing coursework, but that's important information and context that you need as you move into the graduation section of the document. So we felt as a reader that would provide an intuitive flow there. Some other technical edits of note for you all is we did remove the phase-in language for provisions that are now either in full effect or will be in full effect by the time this regulatory action goes through. So there's no need to have those caveats and clauses in the language of the SOA. As I noted before, we did spend some time reflecting on the work of the Office of School Quality, the language that they talk about as it relates to corrective actions, corrective action plans, our comprehensive unified long-range plans for schools and divisions, and our memorandums of understanding to make sure that we were clear and consistent in our language and use of those throughout the document, but particularly in that section on accreditation in 131-400. And also as part of that section, we did reinforce and carry over some language for the standards of quality that reinforces the board's authority to require division-level academic reviews. This is language that's carried, again, verbatim from the standards of quality, but thought it was a helpful complement, again, to fully contextualize the relationship between schools, divisions, and the board in this exercise. Just a handful of substantive proposals for you all to reflect on as we close out this work. And before we jump in, I will start with one of the more kind of substantive discussions that came from our last meeting. And this is one of the ones that we're going to be revisiting. And if you recall, and as Dr. Anderson provided a bit of a preface around, we did bring a proposal last month around equity plans as a prerequisite for accreditation with the intent and kind of design of creating some encouraging divisions to think about their data quality and improving data processes in support of some new reporting requirements that the committee approved to carry forward and move forward with. But after reflecting around the origin of that requirement and that proposal, recommendations that we've gotten from stakeholders like ASAC, reflecting on our intent and the use of that language and really what we wanted it to do, and of course, reflecting on the feedback that we got about making meaningful requirements as part of this section, we did land on language that looks, I would say substantively different, but really I think captures and better captures the intent of what we were trying to do with the equity plans, and in a language that we think really kind of elevates and talks about what we want and expect of school divisions in this. I will say it was also a helpful exercise that we were thinking through those pieces of office school quality language around comprehensive unified long-range plans. So we were able to leverage and use existing infrastructure and requirements that already exist at the school and division level to support some of the work we were thinking about doing. So I want to pause there to allow you guys to read this change. Again, I do want to just highlight a few things that we attempted to do with this language. Again, we're leveraging and expanding a requirement that already exists at the school and division level, but we're really providing clarity on what we expect to be included in the comprehensive unified long-range plan. The standards of quality does provide some guidance and language around expectations for those plans, but this really drills in on those expectations as set by the board here. And I think what's perhaps most important is we set a tangible goal for what this plan is intending to do. And it's really making sure that we're getting all of our student groups to that level 1 indicator. That's the end goal here and what we seek to do in accreditation largely. But making sure that when schools and divisions are moving through this exercise to complete their comprehensive unified long-range plans, that goal is in mind and at the forefront of their evaluation of data, synthesis of data, and thinking about tangible action items to move forward with. And I'll still pause there for just a second. I have a few more substantive edits to share with the group, but I know it's a lot of content to read.
Dr. Anderson, could I ask a question? Thank you. Dr. Sale, appreciate all of the work. As I recall, one of the observations about including language around an equity plan was a desire for, I guess, assurance, accountability, if you will, that our divisions are in fact addressing those areas that we know should be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
Can you remind us how the comprehensive or long-range plan, because we are now suggesting that the language and that effort around equity be included,
Mm-hmm.
how might the comprehensive or long-range plan satisfy the desire by this board and others to really understand and be accountable to the efforts around equity? What does that plan look like, and remind us how that works?
Sure. Well, there, of course, is some variability across school divisions on the comprehensive unified long-range plan. And I guess I should also say at the school level. So as a prerequisite for accreditation, this really is an expectation for what should be included in that school level plan. And then, of course, that feeds into the division level plan as required by the standards of quality. So it is going to look a little bit different on a school-by-school basis, of course, based on their individual data, their individual student demographic, and some of the strategic components. But the intent here and the purpose here is, again, to really kind of drill down on what's included in those. I will say there are probably a good number of schools and divisions that may have already satisfied this requirement by virtue of the work that they're already doing. But we wanted to make sure that we are comparably thinking about these shared concerns and shared issues across the board, and the expectation is clearly set forth in that regard. And I hope that maybe speaks to your question, but if I didn't hit on it.
I think it does, but I guess the point I'm making is I think this board was wanting to, as a board, to understand how and that local divisions and or schools are actually wrapping in plans around equity, and to be able to see and understand what that is. So the comprehensive and long-range plan is a document developed at the local level.
Mhm.
Superintendents certify that such a thing exists, but there is, is there a mechanism for outside of the local division for that plan to be public, visible, et cetera? How do we, so I guess I'm trying to help the public understand and others understand what the current process is and how this suggestion furthers what we're already doing, but enhances it. I guess I'm trying to get to giving you the opportunity to talk about how we're going to
Sure.
address the needs that the board has identified.
And I think I should be able to provide a little bit of information there, and of course we can continue to build from there. So for the comprehensive unified long-range plan, there is a requirement in the standards of quality already that those be made publicly available. So we already have a degree of transparency by incorporating these requirements into the comprehensive unified long-range plan. And we've talked about that with respect to reporting, that transparency and accountability is an important part of our overall accreditation model. We do have another accountability mechanism that, as Dr. Wilson mentioned, that division superintendents are required to certify that all of their schools are meeting these prerequisites for accreditation in order to be considered eligible for receiving an accreditation rating. And then I should also add that an important part of that language is what these plans will look like is still a bit in flux, and actually the board will have more opportunity to kind of put a fingerprint on the specifics and what the expectations around these portions portions of the comprehensive unified plan will look like through the guidance document, which we do have outlined in language there. And as part of that work, as we queue you up to think through what those might look like and what we might set as common standards and expectations for these plans, we are also going to be reflecting on staff responsibilities in that regard as well. And there may be opportunities for us to be looking at a handful of these on a periodic basis, doing a desk audit, things like that, to provide another additional layer of accountability there. But there are some existing mechanisms in place by including them in the comprehensive unified long-range plan, and certainly an opportunity to think about additional mechanisms to really drill in and make sure schools and divisions are looking at this language and implementing it and reflecting on it the way that we intended.
Ms. Holt?
So this is beautiful, Dr. Sayles. I really like this language. Y'all have done a great job on this, and I think it will be a great enhancement. I have just one, and this may be my misunderstanding, but these are school level plans, but obviously are in conjunction with division level planning. But the language here says, do we need a little more clarity around what's the division responsibility versus the school? So for instance, there's a sentence that says, the plan should address how the division will allocate resources. Well, that's right, because divisions allocate resources, but the school can't tell the division how to allocate resources. And then the next sentence says, as part of its plan, the school should reflect on. So you just might want to make sure you've got the clarity about what the school is doing and what the division is doing and how they interact.
Sure, and we can continue to refine that language to make sure the interface around who's responsible for what and how these plans interact with one another. Because as I mentioned before, there is both a school level comprehensive unified long-range plan and a division level one. So we wanted to make sure that this requirement does in many ways speak to both, but because accreditation is at the school level, this will ultimately, the kind of initial onus will be on the individual
Really,
school.
am I right? The right way to think of it is that the division is adopting. Ultimately, the division is approving the plan for each of its schools?
They adopt their own comprehensive unified long-range plan and are required to take into account the individual school's plan in doing so.
But I understand the division adopts its own plan,
Mm-hmm.
but does the division have to approve at some stage the school level plan?
And I might actually defer to someone with some
And I
practitioner
don't actually
experience. on-
necessarily need an
Mhm.
answer here, but it just, you might just think about the.
I have an edit that may make this better that I'll suggest. The division does not always approve the school plan. So what we may want to say there is the plan should address how the division has allocated resources to improve the performance of all student groups to the school. So essentially, they can talk about what money they've received from the division and how they're going to spend it for this purpose.
Well, I like telling the division, are we somewhere else telling the division as part of its plan that it should allocate resources, that it must address, that its plan must address how it will allocate resources to improve the performance, because that's actually one of the most powerful lines in there. But it really maybe is more appropriately directed to the division's plan than to the schools.
And I'll have to ask a clarification from the team. Is there another place where we talk about what's required in the division plan? So we'll just add that there.
Yeah.
It's in the standards of quality.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yes, it's in standard 6 of the standards of quality that it talks about the division expectations for what should be in the plan. So it does, again, it is a shall that they have to take into account the school's plans. And we focus on the school here again because of where the accreditation
Right, okay.
falls. But
So it maybe you can't fix this completely
Not in this
here,
place. Yeah.
But we could certainly, I guess maybe in addition to Dr. Lane's edits, talk about how the division has allocated and communicate additional needs for.
I'm prepared to defer to you all on
for
as
the-
this on
for the
technical
resource.
edits, but
Mhm. But sure, we can make sure that those respective roles and responsibilities are clearly delineated, so it's clear that this is the school's plan, but, to the extent that we can, making sure that the division's plan takes into account all of this. Any other questions on this piece?
Well, considering the discussion, I think this might be a good opportunity at this point to since we're looking to get more clarity here, to address the concern that was brought up to me about providing clarity around whether or not this language is intended to address successful outcomes for all students or all student groups. And, I'll allow President Yecker to expand on that if he'd like, but I just thought it was an appropriate time since we're having this discussion around this topic.
Sure. And I will say, I think the intent of our language here is to support all students, but by way of understanding your data as disaggregated by student group. So we're having them drill in on how opportunity and performance is happening at the student group level, but the goal obviously being that everyone in the school is going to benefit from the strategies that put into place that individually support these student groups that we've seen achievement gaps or opportunity gaps. So obviously the end goal always being all students, but to drive in on the data, strategic action and supporting students would be at the student group level. That would be kind of the point of reflection.
I think I understood that answer, but I'm not 100% sure. No, I'm serious about this. I really do think I understood it. Nobody wants to say we don't care about all the students and increasing performance of all students. The paragraph largely speaks to, eliminating, or maybe it's reducing achievement gaps. And so in most of the paragraph, we talk about the student groups because that's where we're going to get the data. Are we, how do we measure success? All right. And I'm assuming that the way we're looking to measure success is that we have no diminution in the upper group, who are the higher performing group, and we have a reduction in the gap between the higher performing group and all the other subgroups. Or what was the current reporting term? There's a student groups. Thank you. Is that how we measure success?
In some ways in accreditation, so there are obviously kind of measures that, and Shelley might be able to jump in and help me on this one too. There are some measures that kind of evaluate on a baseline expectation, and then there's some that evaluate the gaps between student groups. And maybe I'm not speaking to the question, but I think the accreditation model, because it takes into account a number of different indicators, that both of those items are reflected.
Right. Now, I think I understand something about the accreditation model overall, but if we're asking for this requirement, it ought to be sort of, in our view, causally connected to a result we're trying to achieve, but there's no point in asking for the requirement, right? So I don't really have a handle yet on what a plan looks like, but but what I'd like to know, and I guess, it may be just, well, you look to see if the school is accredited, but that won't really answer necessarily the subgroup or the student group question for all the student groups. So again, are we looking here, is success measured by, like I said, the higher performing group staying at least where it was or increasing, and all the other student groups, reducing the gap? Is that success here?
I think so. I think that sentence in the middle is what drives that, is that we're moving every student group to the level 1 standard, right? So you have to be level 1 with all students to be accredited. And then there are ways you become accredited with conditions if schools fall below the level 1 standard. What this is saying is, even if you're an accredited school, we still want to see how you're going to progress towards every student group being at level 1.
Yeah, but even if every student group's at a level 1, you're still going to have potentially an achievement gap, right?
It's potentially possible because the standard is 70%.
Exactly.
Right.
So you can have one doing at 90 and the other at 70. And frankly, I don't think that's the result the board's looking for. That's why, again, you and I have gone back and forth on isn't the achievement standard, isn't the accreditation standard enough? And I don't think it is for what I think we're looking to do here. And if I don't understand this, I'm thinking that we put this out and you've got all these people in the field who are going to check the box by doing some, pro forma plan with no real teeth and no real understanding of what it is we're looking to do. I expect that what we do drives behavior. And what I'd like to understand is what behavior we're looking to drive with this language, and how do we get the language to be clearer? We've been certainly misunderstood when we talk about equity plans of, you got people saying we're reducing achievement gaps. Well, you just lower the top people and that's how you reduce the achievement gap. That's clearly not what we mean, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that's come out of the current discourse is the need to be more precise in how we describe what it is we're looking to do.
And part of the staff thinking on this is that because this is in the standards of accreditation, it would be aligned to the accreditation model. I think there's a worthy debate to be had of whether the pass rate should be higher, moving forward, right? And that we continue to move pass rates higher until all student groups are at the same pass rate.
Yeah, but we're not at that point yet. Right now, what we're at is, if we do this, I mean, what you're basically saying is if I get every student group up past 70, I'm fine. But that really doesn't meet the language of closing, and we have here eliminating, which is, has anybody in the Commonwealth actually eliminated the achievement gap?
Only maybe in their graduation indicator.
Yeah, no, but we're talking here about, I think, the academic achievement.
There are
right?
probably some schools that are not as diverse that may have eliminated that. And I don't want to say
Yeah,
that's
no, we don't, but you get the point, is that we're saying go ahead and eliminate it. We probably, at least are talking about reducing it, at least initially. Or is that, again, I mean, given the paragraph, it's not clear to me what we're looking to do. And I think this is a paragraph, we all agree with what we think it means, right? We want to improve every kid's outcome, right? That's what we think it means. But when it comes down to, the administrator sitting there and saying, how do I allocate my resources to achieve their goal? It's not clear how you do that. I mean, we ought to want to drive resource allocation by what we're doing here.
I agree with that. Part of what I think what school divisions are going to say is, why is the state mandating a standard for me higher than the accreditation standard if this is the standards of accreditation?
And that's fine. And the answer is, what the state cares about today is that every student group reaches, and this is not every student, right? And that's where we get hung up in some of the language, but that every student group reaches that level of educational achievement as every other student group without diminishing where the top group is, right? We had all that, we had Jen do the work on the shape of the curves for the test scores for the student groups. Shockingly to me, the standard deviations in all the groups were largely the same. So now what we're talking about is the mean. We don't have to worry about the shape of the curve. We're just talking about moving the mean performance level for each of those student groups up. And, right, I mean, I think that's where we're going. And maybe it's in the wrong place, but it is a clearly stated goal of this board now, since, for the 6 years I've been here, is to, everything you read is, we're going to reduce achievement gaps. That is reducing the achievement gap, changing the mean of the student groups so that they are more equal. And again, I'll hasten to say, you don't get there by lowering the top. That's not what I mean. I mean by bringing up everybody who is underperforming or performing less to the level of the top performing group.
And so part of what I'm wondering is, and I agree with that, I think it's about moving every group to the top group. Are we then saying that our accreditation standard is too low? You should be going for the accreditation standard and the standards of accreditation. And so if that's about requiring more of our student groups, then I'm open to talking. It's the board's decision, but that's where I think the board should drive it through data accountability too, if you're going to require it in the
I think
plan.
we are looking to do it through data accountability. And we have not yet said we're going to go above the 70%. But what would your school division say, James, if we said tomorrow that not only does the school have to hit 70%, but every student group's got to hit 70%? How many accredited schools are we going to have left?
We say that.
Every subgroup.
Oh, yeah. Now,
And
the way that you methodologically calculate it is you allow one student group to be below
Exactly.
2, puts you into a certain level, and then more and more. Right, but essentially you're saying that every student group has to meet that standard.
And so how do we get to the point where every student group has to meet the top standard?
I think you have to change the standard. Now, because otherwise it's a visionary plan rather than an accreditation plan. Accreditation is a basic standard. Not that it shouldn't be higher. I think it should be higher.
Accreditation is there to drive behavior also, right? It's the concept that if, you have accountability, you're going to change the results. You're going to drive resources to change their results. right? That's why we have the accreditation system. It's just purely accountability. And in theory, that accountability ought to be based on, the vision for the outcomes you want. And if it means, I guess, raising each individual group, or the overall standard, that's something we ought to think about.
That's what I'm saying, is that, I'm not actually saying we shouldn't raise the standard, but if level one.
I guess I'm looking at this and saying, we're going to impose a requirement on 120, whatever it is, jurisdictions. I don't know how many are left after the consolidations. And if all that's going to happen is, somebody in one jurisdiction writes a plan that everybody else then basically photocopies, and that checks the box without really changing what's happening on the ground in each of the individual divisions, that really doesn't achieve any goals for me.
Well, and what my counter to that would be that we have very few school divisions where every school is at the level one standard in every student group.
And what does that mean in terms of this?
It means that every school division is going to have a plan that's going to have to move at least one of their groups.
I guess what we're saying here is a separate plan. And the whole concept of the accountability of the accreditation system is they all ought to want to do that anyway, right?
Right. So,
I mean, the system now is set up in theory to incentivize that.
yeah.
If I am, a superintendent, I want all my schools accredited.
Right. And the thinking here is that it does go slightly beyond accreditation by saying that every group would get to the level one standard.
Yes.
And so,
And then what teeth are there in that? That's really what I'm getting down to. What really says to the division, this is something that we really mean.
the accreditation system is what has driven that historically.
Okay.
All right, we let Dr. Duran weigh in.
Just the thought of looking at the language. I mean, I understand everything has been said, but somewhere maybe in the middle. The language, when it starts, it says, shall include actions to improve the performance of all student groups, to a suggestion to 1, reduce or close achievement gaps, and 2, achieve school quality indicator improvement to the level 1 standard. And then as these plans are submitted, we're looking at both. So we are trying to achieve, and to your point, Dr. Lane, many school divisions can work towards level 1 standard, but maybe a second component of this plan has to say, well, great, and if you've met that, what are some of the things you're doing to either close or reduce achievement gaps? So have it be 2 parts, and to be very specific in here and saying 1 and 2. Just a suggestion for my committee members or Chair Anderson.
Or even once every student group is at the level 1 standard, then you must further focus on this plan on eliminating
Or closing or reducing.
Yeah.
Just some other way to tweak this a little bit to get, I think, not completely what you're asking, Mr. Gecker, but to move us more in that direction of being very intentional and strategic about saying to school divisions, yes, this is our standard right now. That's a whole different conversation, but this is our level 1 standard. We need one there. But beyond that, that's not enough. There are some subgroups that are going to be still very disproportionate and have a lot of disparity amongst other groups, even when they're in level 1. So what's a plan to address that and have 2 components that are part of this language? Just a
Thank you, Dr.
suggestion.
Duran. Dr. Wilson?
Just a reaction to Dr. Duran's suggested language and then Dr. Lane's amendment or alternate language. I think as a board member, I would want to not find us over prescribing for what local leaders and boards have a responsibility to do. I think our approach, which I think I hear resonant in Dr. Duran's suggested language, lays a marker, but it allows divisions the professional or expects the professionalism and care to do what we, so I would just caution us. Yes, we know that there is an urgency. There has been an urgency. That urgency is not going to go away. But we I think, should be very thoughtful about over-prescribing in ways that take responsibility away from schools and divisions.
I am not suggesting we prescribe means and methods. I am
I understand.
suggesting we prescribe goals. And frankly, and I know, there's a range of where you can be on how much the state ought to play and how much the locals. I mean, it seems to me as long as the locals are, doing fine, the state ought to step back. I mean, I frankly would have us do a lot less with divisions that are doing well in terms of the burden we place. On the other hand, our obligation is to the system that educates kids. And if you have jurisdictions that year after year after year after year don't meet these, I mean, we have jurisdictions where you have a complete generation of school kids who did not get, an education of quality at all. I mean, not base level quality. And at some point, we have to say, yeah, we can prescribe here. And, that's a fight I'd be willing to take on. And I understand the constitutional issues with operation of school systems and all that stuff. But at some point, you got to say our responsibility as the overall educational policy, subject only to the General Assembly, is to make sure these kids are educated. And if we see that fail year after year after year, like I said, I have no problem with the state being prescriptive. I would dare tell, Arlington what to do. They're doing fine, right? Don't need to be there. But, I'm not going to pick on individual jurisdictions now, but we know where the problems are. And we ought to be saying to those people, you've got to do better, and here's what you've got to do.
And I don't disagree with you, Mr. Gecker, but this document is for all. It's not for the subset that you're talking. So my concern or my observation is that whatever lever we pull, that we pull the right, and if it's a different lever to get to those divisions that are not performing and historically have not performed, the question is this the right place to do that, which affects everyone? Will it appear that we are punishing all for what some are not able to produce? So that's my only observation.
Punishment is a harsh word.
I understand, but I believe at some level, if it is felt as heavy-handed, that's how it will feel, whether we intend it or
I
not.
would be happy to build into this a carve out that says if you've met certain standards for a period of time, well, you don't need to worry about this for a while, and we can talk about defining what each of those things mean.
So I would like to offer, Dr. Duran recommended
Yeah.
some proposed language change. And not to put you on the spot, but just to maybe present an alternative. Do you have, President Gecker, some example of what language you think would add?
Honestly, I was just trying to understand again what we were looking to do, because it wasn't 100% clear to me. Happy to speak between now and the meeting at which this is adopted or addressed again with staff and talk through what might help, or frankly just let it go. I mean, I know I'm not even on your committee, so I have to be careful here. But I think for the board to focus on, if this is going to be viewed as punishment, that's not a good thing either, right? Unless, frankly, it's going to achieve a goal. Then I'm willing to have it viewed as punishment a little bit if it's going to achieve a goal. But I just want to understand more clearly what goal we're going to achieve by this, other than to put in, potentially to draft a plan that checks a box.
Sure. I certainly think that the committee and the department and obviously the Commonwealth benefits from any inputs we can receive from the board sooner than later, especially considering the timeline we're working towards. So I appreciate the discussion now. Ms. Holton?
So I just would endorse Dr. Duran's language tweak, which may not solve the whole problem, but I think helps. And in moving on to a different, on Ms. Dr. Sale's next slide, if I may.
Oh, sure.
I I have a question about the college career civic
before-
readiness indicator, but maybe we want to.
Yeah, if I could just confirm if there's any additional discussion on this topic that anyone would like to have. We could always come back towards the end, but, okay, all right. Ms. Holton?
So, and I don't know whether she's going to speak about that next one or whether maybe I should wait for her to speak and then ask my question because maybe she'll answer it.
Sure. Well, and I will jump to the next slide. I was only going to touch on these broadly, so happy to dig in more, Ms. Holton, where it might be helpful. So in addition to the comprehensive unified long-range plan edit, or the comprehensive plan edit as noted on the last slide as a prerequisite of accreditation, there are still a handful of other substantive edits that we wanted to flag for your attention. I will say that the last slide was probably the meatiest of substantive edits, so these are smaller in nature. The first one, just quickly to walk through what our intent here for each of these was moving the cap of locally awarded verified credits from that new section on standard and verified units of credit and the graduation requirements to a guidance document. And this is really just recognizing the evolution and potential use of performance assessments moving forward. So us being a little bit more agile to respond to how those might play into the award of credits moving forward. We also had an amendment on verified credit requirements for transfer students who enter high school after ninth grade, recognizing that there are fewer testing opportunities for these students. We added language, as Ms. Holton has suggested, that permits the board to establish an improvement rate for the college career and civic readiness indicator. This doesn't specify the nature of the improvement rate in the language, but signals that the board can authorize the improvement rate for the CCRI as more data becomes available. And as you've heard in previous presentations, the data is still relatively new, and given COVID data, it's tough to reflect on what exactly an improvement indicator might look like to push forward and move the needle, but wanting to make sure that it's clear that the board is interested and has the ability to add that to the accreditation model as appropriate and as data allows. And of course, that information would be brought back to the board at the time if there was any improvement indicator added. But again, just making sure that we set the marker and establish the ability of the authority to put that in the accreditation model. And then the last item is to eliminate the alternative accreditation plan option for schools of graduating classes smaller than 50. This, as we understand it, would not impact any schools. That anyone smaller than 50 is a specialist program and under an alternative accreditation plan already. So this is just kind of a cleanliness edit, but it is a small policy change, so did want to flag it for you. But with that, Ms. Holton, if I haven't addressed questions, we can certainly circle back to the one that you have.
So I think I do. So we do have a proficiency measure, so to speak, on college career civic readiness. It's the improvement piece that we are giving ourselves the option of adding. So, but to start out with, we're going to be saying schools have to meet the required level or not. There's not going to be any way to succeed other than by meeting that level.
Precisely. The threshold that you establish in accreditation would stay in place, and this recognizes that if schools were to move and improve those scores over the course of years, because we don't have the data to know what that next
so
threshold
obviously
might
that's
look
not
like.
relevant until we have at least a couple of years. Well, but we're keeping the data before we start adding it. I would just encourage us to get the improvement rate in as quickly as we can. I don't have a need to change what we're doing in the SOAs, but the whole nature of our accreditation system is geared towards acknowledging movement in the right direction as well as ultimate results. So the sooner the better.
Absolutely. And I think the cautiousness is just to make sure to our
To get it
ability
right.
that it's not an arbitrary threshold and we can reflect on the data. But we will certainly keep that feedback in mind as we think about how we might operationalize that language. And that is actually, so, and I guess I should say next steps in discussion. This slide is pretty straightforward, and I think you guys are anticipating this already. But assuming we reach a conclusion here as a committee on the package of language edits that we would like to see move forward, our tentative timeline would be to close this out before the end of the board meetings this year, with the full board receiving the committee's recommendations next month for first review and final review of this particular regulatory phase in November 2021, which we, again, as a reminder, we are in the proposed regulatory phase. And now we can circle back to our questions and discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Sale. We appreciate your efforts and the team's efforts to summarize all of the technical and substantive changes included in the SOA. I'm going to open the floor up for any additional discussion, but I will go ahead and just capture, based on the previous discussions, that from what I capture, that going in from here, at least into the October session, we would want to consider some revised language to the comprehensive plan as proposed by Dr. Duran. If you did or didn't capture that, maybe we can work on that afterwards. And then also maybe continue some discussions based on feedback from President Gecker, if there might maybe some other proposed recommendations as far as language. And then in the October session, looking at what that is, and at that point, seeing if we can get consensus from the board on what right looks like.
Sure.
All right, so again, at this point, just opening the floor up, whether it's for the technical substantive changes that were discussed today or anything else that you may have identified in the red line document relative to the SOAs. Dr. Duran?
Just a clarification question, Ms. Fulton. I think we know the answer, but I want to be clear. So after the November action in the proposed stage that we're in, when does all this actually come into effect?
So we're still a bit of a ways away. So we are in the proposed phase of regulatory action, and after the board approves it, it will move through the normal kind of stages of executive action and review. Then it will return to the board for the final review, which we will do a first and final review at the final stage of regulatory action, and then again it will move through the executive action review. Generally speaking, regulatory actions of this scale are estimated to take 18 months. I know we are part of the way through that process, so don't have a timeline for what this next leg will look like, but it is a significant timetable.
Thank you. That's what we thought. Thank you.
So, may I, with that?
Ms. Fulton?
And I don't need an answer on this, but just in light of that, thank you, Dr. Duran. We should consider waiving first review every opportunity we can on anything we're doing regulatory. And sometimes there's reasons not to, but this one does feel like something we've discussed this at such great length. And then we're going to have another round of it on the finals. Maybe we can do it in October, not November. Just saying. I know it's big and we don't like to waive final review on big things, but it's final isn't really final. It's just final proposed.
My only advice on that is there are not as many people that watch our work sessions as watch
Well,
our board meetings. And it,
But we've been talking, yeah, well,
two
and we haven't talked about
opportunities to
this in the
comment.
board meetings at all? We must have.
Sure.
Okay, I hear you. I'm
Not with the definitiveness that you will
I
hear next
defer
month.
to others, but
Miss-
I don't need an explanation. It's just,
Well,
the 18-month part is ridiculous.
Sure. I just want to note, you're not allowed to make substantive changes between proposed and final that aren't in response to public comment.
Got
So
it.
really, where we need to focus our efforts is proposed stage rather than final stage, if that makes sense.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Any other comments, questions, discussion?
Thank the committee for all the hard work and the staff. I mean, we have been talking about this for a very long time, and these issues are very important, and I just appreciate the diligence that's being exercised around these issues, so.
Year and a half. Thank you for that. Appreciate that. All right, I echo that sentiment as well for my fellow committee members and for the inputs from the board and of course from the VDOE and your work in providing us the information we needed just to really be informed and throughout this process. And so if there's not any other discussion, then I will wrap up this portion of our committee by thanking everyone for today's robust discussion and approval of the recommendations pending next month to move forward with the full board approval, hopefully in November. Again, we plan to bring some final recommendations and proposed revisions, SOA revisions in October for first review, and ideally on final review the following month. So thank you all for your time and engagement today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. We ready for the work session?
Are we ready for the work session?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. We're going to keep rolling. I think that the plan will be to accept the status update as, in the materials. I have the live presentation on, by Dr. Hollins, and then just postpone the discussion on the book until next month, perhaps. And I guess Dr. Davis Vaught and Mr. Swan put a copy of that book on your seats before. So you have your reading assignment. And Ms. Holton, you're going to be out west. It is good for you to have some reading material on your trip.
Exactly my plan.
Exactly. Okay. I'm assuming everybody else has done what they're supposed to do here. All right, Dr. Hollins.
Thank you so much, President Gecker, Vice President Wilson, board members, and Dr. Lane. It's my pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I have a brief presentation, so I'll go through it relatively quickly, and I'm happy to answer any questions or concerns or address any comments you direct as a result of it. I would like to mention, typically you see me as a solo performer, but today I am very excited to be joined by two of my very talented staff members. I have my director of the Office of Facilities and Family Engagement, Mr. Hank Millward, and my specialist for state operated programs, Ms. Lori Cooper. These folks behind me are tireless advocates for the students we'll be talking about today. And with the three of us, you have the entire staffing around state operated programs for the Commonwealth of Virginia. So you're welcome for us bringing everybody to you this afternoon. As I mentioned, the presentation today will be focused on state-operated programs, particularly for your review. And I know you received a copy of the report that came from the work group as a result of General Assembly legislation. But I thought to myself, this is a topic that we don't typically address very frequently. And I just want to also recognize the great leadership that this group of students and programs has had from Dr. Lane and Mr. Fairhart. As you can imagine, there are a lot of competing priorities at the department. And this represents a smaller subset of students that we serve, but in our minds, it's one of the most important groups that we serve due to the vulnerability of the student population. So just a really great environment to work in and bring attention to these amazing programs. You'll see on the slide before you the regulatory background that identifies the roles and responsibilities of the Board of Education. And we take it very seriously that it's our responsibility to fulfill the duties of the board when it comes to these programs across the state of Virginia. This slide details the roles and responsibilities and the function of those roles as you see them out in practice among the state-operated programs. And so you'll see everything about fiscal management, direction of funding to support programs, monitoring the growth and change of those programs over time, ensuring compliance with both the federal and state requirements and regulatory requirements that must be in place, not only through Virginia code, but also through federal education legislation and law. We also spend a lot of time devoting technical assistance and instructional support to the state-operated programs across the state. That is a role that falls on us here at the department. And probably the reason you haven't seen Ms. Cooper before is that she is out on the road for quite a bit of her responsibilities, being boots on the ground, working with our state-operated program principals and making sure these programs have everything they need in order to be successful. We also work directly with many of our contractual agencies, which include at times other state agencies, but also local school divisions to ensure that the personnel that we have operating our state-operated programs are qualified and able to provide the best service to our students. And even though we don't directly hire staff, we are providing input as to the qualifications and are at times asked to sit on interview panels to ensure the best candidates are selected. A little bit about what state-operated programs actually are. You see on your slide the compilation of programs that fall under this umbrella. I know that Dr. Robertson, due to his work on the work group, is familiar, and I know that Secretary Holton has also worked with some of these programs as a result of her previous role and responsibility. The state-operated programs contain 24 juvenile detention facilities, our 3 hospital education programs, which are located at the University of Virginia, Virginia Commonwealth University, and the Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters, our 7 off-site VDH clinics that are not tied to a hospital education program, our juvenile and adult mental health facilities that we run in partnership with the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services, and our continuing partnership with Wilson Workforce and Rehabilitation Center. So all of those programs come under the umbrella of state-operated programs. I think sometimes that's one of the biggest misconceptions we address with the community at large. We have engaged in a lot of traffic about state-operated programs. And I think the biggest concern has really been a focus on our juvenile detention centers. However, as I just explained to you, state-operated programs actually encompass a much larger array of programs that are very unique due to the characteristics of students that they serve. And as you can imagine, we're talking about students who are court involved. We're talking about students with significant mental health conditions and needs. We're also talking about students with chronic healthcare issues and severe medical needs as well. So it's really important to us that we focus on the vulnerable student populations that we work with as part of these programs and work to implement both the state and federal requirements. As you can imagine, there's also a very large cross-section of students within these programs that are both identified with a disability or English language learners as well. And so those same supports that we provide in our local school divisions are available for our students in their state-operated programs. We also provide a service for our local school divisions. As you can imagine, these students come from around the Commonwealth from a variety of different school divisions. And so when they are with us in the state-operated programs, they are actually enrolled in the SOP. And so we help to make sure that we can ensure continuity of service to students as well as identification, so the divisions don't have to contend with issues about tracking students or having issues around chronic absenteeism because they've lost a kid somewhere in this very comprehensive system. And so just pointing to some of the very specific nature of the programs, these are funded directly from the State Appropriations Act. So every year we provide information to the Department of Planning and Budget and to the state funding to let them know what's changing in these programs. For example, this year we're looking at an expansion of 2 of our hospital programs. Both Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters and MCVVCU are expanding their programs to offer support for students with significant healthcare needs because those populations are growing. And so we really have to make sure that we're resourcing them appropriately so that the educational needs can be met. The biggest requirement that we see is that we're providing an education that's comparable to what students would receive in their local school divisions. However, we know that comparable is the floor for these students, right? We really need to focus on making sure their needs are met and a focus on some of their very unique characteristics and needs across the programs. I want to just bring your attention quickly to the budget language that was given to us during the 2021 session. As I mentioned, there's been some pretty significant attention on juvenile detention facilities, really myopic, in fact. So we've had studies that have looked at juvenile detention center staffing. For example, there was a Department of Juvenile Justice study that was performed in 2013. This was a result of a Commission on Youth study that was released earlier this year, and JLARC is now continually in process of studying the staffing related to juvenile detention facilities. They anticipate providing that report in 2021. So every year we really kind of hit with a new study specifically looking at staffing of juvenile detention centers. We also entertain some very specific legislative requests for data for these programs specifically every year. And so you'll see a lot of that reflected in this study language to once again take a look at the staffing and deem if it's appropriate. And if it's not, where can we make some adjustments to have cost savings that the board can then use and redirect as necessary? These inquiries have all focused on the decrease on the average daily population in our juvenile detention centers, which is something that is happening. However, that population is very significantly impacted continuously. And so we see, even though the numbers over time have dropped, we've seen a continuing need of students coming in and out of that system and needing to be provided education. We've also done a lot of supportive educating from legislators as well as other folks in the field to understand that regardless of the number of students, we need to be able to maintain staffing to offer a comparable education because we never know who's going to walk through the door in some of these programs, right? And so we have to be ready to maintain compliance with what we're having to offer to students. I want to walk through a little bit about what the work group did when we met together. And so there were some required members and we had some really great discussion. I want to thank all of the work group members. Hopefully some are listening in on YouTube today, but really want to thank in particular our principals of our state operated programs. You can imagine how busy they are and the fact that they took time out to come to the table and really make sure the needs of their students were met was really important to us, as well as the Virginia Juvenile Detention Association. We met over 2 days this summer. We actually had to flex on that last day. We got a little bit tangled up with the special session calendar, so we made sure to work with our legislative partners to acquiesce to their schedule so that we could get them a time and date that worked for them. Many of the innovations that we discussed during the meeting and were put forth in the study recommendation are things that VDOE has sought to address over time. What we've also seen is that the department itself has been plagued with a lack of staffing and support to adequately oversee and provide leadership to the state operated programs. I mentioned that the three of us are all that it was now, but we actually at one point had 2.5 FTE addressed to state operated programs. And over time, before any of us were here, those positions kind of gradually were whittled away due to turnover in staff. And so one of the things for your consideration is really thinking about how we can continue to offer support for some of these innovative programs with additional state level oversight and leadership. And that's something that, quite frankly, we've talked directly with JLARC about. And we think that they're in line with thinking about that due to some of the previous discussions we've had on other areas as well. The report from the work group includes useful background information on the state operated programs, and we also had the opportunity to engage in very small, very detailed discussions that were then rotated. So every member of the work group had an opportunity to weigh in on kind of the foundational pieces of the study as required, but also hear a lot about what we're actually talking about when we talk about state operated programs, as well as balancing out the federal and state requirements that are necessary to maintain compliance with what we're required to do and what the board is required to do. We took that information and we produced a draft report that was then shared with each work group member. We had a pretty substantive time for information edits and feedback to come back to us here at the department. And as a result, we're able to offer the final draft report for your review at this time. I just want to highlight some of the major recommendation areas, and you'll see these in the final piece of the report. But we see a lot about thinking about how we can continue to be innovative while also serving students, and thinking about how we could build off of some of the progress we've seen across the state recently, with thinking a little differently and a little creatively about how we serve students in the best way possible. The first, as I mentioned, is seeing increasing staffing, leadership, and support from the Virginia Department of Education. It was definitely a recommendation of the work group that more oversight around compliance, as well as ensuring that the programs are offering the support needed, is necessary. And quite frankly, one specialist to do that on a state level is just not sufficient. And thinking about how we can continue to collect more data and study this issue and bring additional specific recommendations back, we see this as an integral part of that recommendation. You also see there's consideration of some pretty innovative staffing and program models, everything from thinking about how we can flex current positions, use them across different settings, incentivizing dual certified and shared positions, and a creation of staff to serve on an as-needed basis. Many of you probably see a lot of overlap with what we talk about with teacher retention and recruitment here, and those issues are not our state operated programs are not immune to those issues as well. And we do struggle to maintain adequate and qualified staffing. And so thinking about how we can utilize staff to the best way possible is definitely something we want some more time to look into. But also, if this last 18 months has taught us anything, it's thinking about how we can also benefit from advances in enhanced online and asynchronous instructional options. You can imagine the caveats that has, technology in particular, for some of these specific student populations, but we think that is a field where we could really see some growth and development, and also offer an opportunity to these students to have access and be exposed to educational and instructional opportunities that can challenge them and engage them. In particular, for our juvenile detention centers, we see that engagement translate as higher graduation outcomes, which also leads to a reduction in recidivism, which quite frankly is the goal that we have for that group of students. And last but certainly not least, we feel that we need additional time and support to truly study and inform the next steps of the department and the board to make sure that recommendations and alternatives that we choose are truly necessary in keeping with the high standard we have for instruction for these students and a commitment to a very vulnerable student population. I'd like to thank everyone for the time today, and particularly Dr. Robertson, who just valiantly served on this work group and in his usual fashion helped folks to feel calm, helped them to feel collected, and really felt that their voices were valued. And so we had some really rich feedback during the report generation process, and I think that was a direct result of his leadership. So at this point, I will pause. I'm happy to answer any questions or comments, and I'd also offer Dr. Robertson an opportunity to remark on anything that he noticed as part of the work group.
Dr. Robertson?
I was honored to be asked to serve with the group. Thank you, President Gecker and Emily, for making me ask. And I suspect Dr. Lane had his fingerprints on that too. It was a great group to work with as we were responding to the legislative charge that was handed to us. I want to especially call out the team that we have present here right now. Sam and Lori and Hank truly provided the leadership that we needed each step of the way. Excuse me. It's not emotion.
I get emotional too, Dr. Robertson, when we talk about these programs. Don't be ashamed of it.
I don't know if it's the mask or sore throat. Excuse me. Dr. Melinda Boone provided a lot of valuable input, as well as the JDC superintendents and principals. It was inspiring to work alongside them in response to the challenge that they were given. I think what you're learning here is that there are a variety of state-operated programs. What they all have in common is a vulnerable population. I think, too, something that's striking is that federal and state statutes do require that we provide a comparable education for all of the children served in these settings. But in Virginia, we aspire to also increase their student achievement, increase the graduation rate, and also to provide them with skills and abilities to be very productive as they exit the settings that they're in. So it really is complex, and the notion that we can find efficiencies and to reduce costs while trying to achieve those objectives tends to be counterintuitive. I think what we all recognize is that these are our children, and we recognize that we have an obligation to help them increase their achievement and graduate, and to help them imagine and then to support them along the way to a brighter future. That theme was on full display as part of our work here. So I think the recommendations that you have before you in response to the legislative charge do assure efficiency and effectiveness, but they also make sure that key targeted staffing recommendations are put out there. Because when you have a team of 3, or when you have very limited resources to serve this vulnerable population in the way that we know that it should be served, these kinds of recommendations that Sam has elucidated are the right ones. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
First, Dr. Davis Vaught, and then Dr. Lane.
Dr. Hollins and members of your team, I want to say specifically to the 3 of you, I work very closely with the Bristol Detention Center and the folks who are there, the principal, Mr. Bo Love, the teachers, Mrs. Halstead, Mr. Locke, Mr. Honecker. They are dedicated to these children. They reach out to the elementary, the middle, the high to find resources at the students' levels there to meet their needs. And that is a direct representation of your work. You're reaching out to them and supporting them. And it is a beautiful facility to go in and see these children who need us the most, who are still learning at their level and succeeding to the best they can. So thank you very much. You're a mighty force of 3 is all I can say. And the teachers and the principal there in Bristol respect you and your office very much. So congratulations. Thank you so much for all you do. And Stuart, thank you for all that. We are very proud of our center in Bristol and those who run it.
James?
My question is really technical, Dr. Hollins, and I've read this thing several times, and it's just something I didn't think of as I was reading it. But the code section required that we establish recommendations for a system-wide staffing ratio comparable to, and then it goes on and on. Is the suggestion that the bullet at the end of the board's recommendations that the statutorily required 1-to-12 ratio is essentially the ratio that meets that requirement?
Yes, the findings of the work group clarified that the existing regulations enforce compliance, and then staffing that we've taken on as a result of providing a comparable education is sufficient to meet the students' needs.
So, okay, I'm good.
Anybody else?
I'll just comment.
Sure.
I would say quite directly in the last one, if I can recommend an edit. I would say quite directly in the last bullet, in adherence with this section of the code, we recommend 1 to 12 at this time, but would like more time to study and make more recommendations. So just so the patron is clear that we've answered his question.
Yeah, and thank you, Lori. Lori made a mention of it, and you'll see it in the first slide, I believe, that the PREA ratio, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, there is a difference. So in effect, we have 2 regulations that weigh in on the staffing for state-operated programs that require compliance.
And I
And the
think,
112 will meet both, sorry.
I'm sorry, and I think as it relates to patron and the legislative attention that was brought to the process, we should note that Senator Marsden was a regular attendee as part of the work group.
Yeah.
But, and I just, one last piece of clarity, the 1 to 12 meets both regulatory requirements.
So if you look in the statute, it has to be aligned with the staffing requirements provided in the Federal Prison Rape Elimination Act. So Lori, do you want to?
That's 1 to 8.
Yeah,
Teachers
1
don't count.
1 to 8, but teachers don't count in that. It's the school it's security staff.
Yeah, I saw that in the
Yeah.
draft. And so where does the 1 to 12 mandate come from?
The 1 to 12 mandate comes from the Code of Virginia.
Okay. And so what you're saying is 1 to 12 is the teacher to student staffing ratio required in the code. That's your recommendation, is to maintain that. Totally good. And then the federal act requires 1 to 8 overall, including the other staff.
Yes, but does not include teachers.
Right.
Correct.
My recommendation would be to just say that, and that we're, so he's clear that we considered all of that.
Yeah, we're happy to go back and look at a possible edit to make that more transparent.
I just don't want the patron, and I fully recognize Dr. Robertson that he was a participant on the committee. I just wouldn't want him to say we didn't actually make the recommendation he asked us to make. I know you say it earlier in the document. I would just drop it in there
I'm always happy to restate a point,
as a
Dr. Lane.
recommendation. You guys did a great job with this, because I understand way more about this than I did before, and I learned a lot, and so.
Then you have benefited from my education that I have received as a result of Lori Cooper's amazing job over these programs.
That's minor technical edit, and I'll help you with it as we get to tomorrow, whatever.
Okay.
Sounds great. Thank you all so much for your time. Appreciate that.
Thank you. And thanks to both of you for being here today, too. I'm certainly glad the previous discussion didn't scare you guys away. So
It just set us up for a great start to this one, right? The
It
high
did.
expectations. Let's do it.
We certainly lowered expectations. Okay, I think that is it for this, for the board. We will be, no, we're going to take the report as submitted. Okay? No, that's okay. You got to pay attention or you miss things. All right, we are adjourned until tomorrow at 9. We'll see y'all then.